In the autumn of 1396, a royal barge arrived at the coast of England, carrying not a diplomat, not a warrior, but a 6-year-old girl. She was dressed in layers of gold-trimmed velvet, the weight of a nation stitched into every seam. Her name was Isabella of Valois, daughter of the King of France. She was about to become the Queen of England. Her bridegroom, King Richard II, 29 years old, politically embattled, desperate for peace. Their marriage, hastily arranged under the Treaty of Paris, wasn't a fairy tale. It was a truce. According to the Westminster Chronicle, Isabella's coronation was a surreal spectacle. A child drowned in robes of state. The crown slipped on her head. Her feet didn't touch the floor. She didn't speak English. She didn't know the man beside her. But she was now queen. 4 years later, she would be a widow, trapped in a collapsing kingdom, her crown stripped away before she even understood its weight. We remember the powerful queens, but what about those too young to fight, too young to speak? This is the story of Isabella of Valois, the forgotten child bride of England, whose life reveals just how cruel royal diplomacy could be. Isabella of Valois wasn't born to be a queen. She was born to be a bargaining chip. In the late 14th century, England and France were locked in a brutal generational war. The 100 Years' War, already over 50 years old, had drained both kingdoms to the bone. The Treaty of Paris in 1396 was an attempt to halt the bloodshed, not through military victory, but through matrimony. Enter Isabella. At just 6 years old, she was selected by her father, King Charles VI of France, to marry England's King Richard II. Charles's court viewed the match as politically advantageous, a symbolic end to hostilities. French chronicler Jean Froissart wrote that Charles referred to Isabella as a princess whose innocence could heal old wounds. That innocence, of course, came at a cost. From the English perspective, the marriage was controversial. Many lords objected to her age. She was years away from childbearing and spoke no English. But Richard pressed ahead. As historian Michael Bennett notes, Richard's aim was less a dynasty than an image of peace. A child bride, untouched by war, would serve as a living emblem of reconciliation. And so, a royal procession was planned. On November 4th, 1396, Isabella crossed into English territory under heavy guard. She brought with her a lavish dowry, dozens of attendants, and ivory dolls said to be carved by Parisian craftsmen. But beneath the silks and ceremony, one thing was clear. This was not a marriage, but a political performance. Isabella was not consulted. Her opinions, her desires, her future, none of it mattered. What mattered was what she symbolized: obedience, alliance, and a pause in bloodshed. This isn't just a sad anecdote about a girl in a gown. It's a window into a world where royal children were diplomatic tools, and innocence was a currency easily spent. In 1396, Isabella's arrival in England wasn't greeted with joy. It was met with unease. For Richard II, the Treaty of Paris was a personal triumph. War had exhausted his kingdom, and he hoped that marrying the daughter of Charles VI, France's reigning monarch, would not only secure peace, but elevate his prestige across Europe. Yet not all his subjects agreed. Many members of the English nobility saw the treaty, and the marriage it sealed, as a humiliation. Isabella was 6 years old, unable to produce heirs, unaware of English customs, and wholly dependent on foreign advisors. Parliament resisted. Critics feared Richard had traded long-term dynastic security for short-term diplomatic theater. According to historian Nigel Saul, Richard's insistence on marrying a child was a political gamble, an attempt to style himself as a peacemaker, even at the cost of appearing absurd. But Richard persisted. The ceremony was held at Calais, then under English control. There, Isabella was formally handed over. Froissart recorded that she wore a gown woven with threads of silver and was accompanied by over 500 attendants. The marriage was per verba de presenti, legally binding, though not consummated. Richard, to his credit, treated Isabella gently. Froissart noted he kissed her hand and called her his noble little queen. Some have interpreted this as paternal affection, though others suggest it was careful performance, a ruler clinging to royal image during growing domestic instability. And instability was growing. Richard's court had become increasingly autocratic. He had executed members of his own council, clashed with Parliament, and elevated unpopular favorites. The marriage to Isabella, instead of calming tensions, further inflamed resentment. His political enemies, particularly Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, saw in this French alliance a dangerous vanity. Meanwhile, Isabella, newly crowned at Westminster Abbey, was barely able to walk in her ceremonial robes. The Westminster Chronicle observed the absurdity with blunt clarity. The child did not understand her coronation, but was told it was a game of kings. In this game, Isabella was never meant to move. She was a pawn, placed carefully, photographed in the mind's eye, and then quietly set aside. But pawns are often caught in the first wave of battle. After the coronation, Isabella was settled into court life, if one could call it that. She was lodged at Windsor Castle, then moved to various palaces, always under guard, always surrounded by formality. Her household included a governess, tutors, musicians, and a full staff of French-speaking attendants. Yet she was largely cut off from meaningful interaction. She played with ivory dolls imported from Paris. She received gilded prayer books she could not yet read. And she was the subject of endless pageantry she could not possibly comprehend. At court, she was paraded during feast days, made to sit through royal ceremonies, and used as visual proof that peace with France was real. But her daily routine was rigid and isolating. Historian Helen Castor notes that Isabella's household was lavishly provisioned, yet emotionally barren. Richard visited her occasionally, usually bearing gifts, sometimes dressed in extravagant silks, meant to impress her attendants as much as the child herself. But this was no love story. Their interactions were ceremonial at best. Richard often called her his noble angel, but to others, she was a reminder of his increasing detachment from political reality. Isabella, meanwhile, began to fade into a kind of royal purgatory. She didn't speak the language. She wasn't permitted to return to France, and she wasn't allowed to mix with English children of similar rank. Too dangerous, too unpredictable. Her role was symbolic, not social. Outside the palace walls, tensions rose. Richard's enemies were regrouping. Henry Bolingbroke, exiled by the king, was gathering support on the continent. Parliament had grown bolder. Rebellion smoldered in the north, and yet Richard, increasingly paranoid and aloof, spent lavishly on court entertainments and decorative architecture, including tapestries celebrating his marriage to Isabella. Behind every scene of those tapestries was a silence that echoed through Isabella's daily life. She was a queen in name only. No agency, no authority, just ceremony. She had been brought to England to seal peace. Instead, she became the silent witness to its final unraveling. The collapse came swiftly. In 1399, Richard II left for Ireland to quell a rebellion. In his absence, Henry Bolingbroke, recently exiled and dispossessed, returned to England with a small army and a mission: reclaim his inheritance and perhaps more. Richard, overconfident and increasingly isolated, underestimated the danger. By the time he returned, it was too late. Captured and imprisoned, Richard was forced to abdicate in favor of Henry, who was crowned Henry IV. Isabella, barely 9, suddenly found herself a queen without a king, and in a court where her status was a liability. Henry IV had little interest in harming the child queen. To do so would risk offending Charles VI of France, her father, a king whose unstable mental health didn't prevent him from wielding unpredictable political influence. As historian Chris Given Wilson observes, Henry's treatment of Isabella was cautious. She was a pawn, but a volatile one. Mishandling her could provoke war. So, Isabella was placed under honorable custody at Sonning and later Havering Atte Bower, royal residences turned elegant prisons. French envoys petitioned for her immediate return. Henry delayed, citing logistics and political considerations. More likely, he sought to retain leverage. Her dowry, a key element of the Treaty of Paris, was never returned. In diplomatic terms, this was a calculated insult. France had offered peace through marriage. England had removed the husband, kept the wife, and refused to give back what had been paid for the alliance. Back in France, Charles VI's court oscillated between outrage and confusion. Rumors reached Isabella that Richard was still alive. Others claimed he had died of starvation in Pontefract Castle. Froissart, while vague, suggested Richard met a quiet end, an ominous euphemism likely masking murder. Isabella, still unaware of the full truth, remained a widow in every practical sense. Finally, in 1401, after mounting pressure, Henry allowed her to return, stripped of titles, her dowry unrecovered. The journey back to France was less a homecoming than a retreat. She had arrived in England as a royal peacemaker. She left as a diplomatic orphan. She was not yet 11. Isabella's return to France should have marked a new beginning. Instead, it marked the start of her quiet disappearance from history. She was received honorably, but coolly. The French court had moved on. Her father, Charles VI, remained mentally unstable, prone to violent delusions. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, was preoccupied with factional chaos. There was no place for a returned Queen of England who had failed to secure peace or bear children. Yet she remained politically useful. In 1406, Isabella, then 16, was remarried, this time to Charles, Duke of Orléans, aged 11. The match was again diplomatic, meant to reinforce internal French alliances during the Armagnac-Burgundian civil conflict. She died 2 years later, in childbirth. 17 years old. No surviving children. No political legacy. Her death, unremarked by English chroniclers, was little more than a footnote in the Orléans family records. And still, her story matters. Because Isabella represents a class of royal women whose lives were never their own. She had no scandal, no uprising, no famous speeches, only obedience, only ceremony. She was used to end a war, then discarded when the peace proved inconvenient. Her ivory dolls may still lie in buried trunks somewhere, their carved faces a mockery of the girl who once held them. Today, she is rarely mentioned, overshadowed by louder queens, forgotten by national myth. But Isabella's silence speaks volumes. She reminds us that monarchy, for all its pageantry, could be ruthlessly transactional, that the crown often demanded not greatness, but sacrifice, and that the youngest, the quietest, the most obedient were often the first to be consumed. So before we close her story, ask this: how many more Isabellas lie buried in the margins of history? Girls promised peace, but given only pageantry and graves.